Picture this. You're standing at the entrance of a cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in what is now northern Israel. It's around 100,000 years ago. Inside the cave, in a shallow pit that someone dug by hand, there's a body. It's been placed on its side, knees slightly bent, like someone sleeping. And next to it, deliberately, unmistakably placed, is the lower jaw of a wild boar. Nobody told this person to do that. There was no book, no priest, no tradition handed down through 1,000 years of organized religion. Someone just decided that the dead needed something, that the act of putting a body in the ground meant something, that maybe, just maybe, something continued after the body stopped working. That cave is called Skhul, and what happened there is one of the oldest known examples of intentional human burial on the planet. Here's the thing that should make you stop for a second. The person who dug that pit and placed that jaw next to that body was not doing something practical. They were doing something symbolic. They were making a statement about what they believed, without words, without writing, without any of the tools we normally use to communicate belief, just a hole in the ground and an object placed with intention. And when archaeologists found it roughly 90,000 years later, they understood immediately that something profound had happened there. Because burial, real, deliberate, ritualistic burial, is not just about disposing of the dead. It's about the relationship between the living and the dead. It implies that the dead still matter, that they have a status, that something about them continues, or should continue, or deserves to be marked. It implies, in other words, that whoever did this believed in something beyond the physical end of a life. And that is one of the most staggering things you can find in the archaeological record. So the question is, when did that start? When did humans first begin burying their dead? And what does that act actually tell us about when we started believing in something after death? The answer is older than you think, and stranger, and more contested, and honestly more moving than most things you'll read about this week. Let's go back. First, let's establish why burial is such a big deal from an archaeological standpoint. Death is universal. Every animal dies. But what you do with the body after death, that's where things get philosophically interesting. Most animals don't do anything. The body falls, scavengers come, the biological process continues. Some animals, elephants, chimpanzees, certain corvids, show signs of distress around their dead. They linger, they touch the body, they behave in ways that suggest some awareness that something significant has happened. But they don't bury, they don't place objects, they don't appear to perform any kind of ritual act. Burial is different. Burial requires several things happening in a mind at once. It requires the recognition that the person is gone, not sleeping, not returning. It requires some kind of emotional or social response to that absence. It requires the idea that the body should be treated in a specific way, not just left. And it requires the belief, or at least the intuition, that this treatment matters, that it has meaning beyond the practical. That last part is the crucial one. When you bury someone with grave goods, with objects, with food, with tools, you are implying that those things will be needed, or that they have symbolic value in whatever comes next. You are encoding a belief about continuity, about what the dead person still is, or still needs, or still deserves. And that is a cognitive leap of enormous proportions. To think symbolically about death, to treat it as a transition rather than a termination, you need a mind capable of abstract thought, of imagining things that cannot be seen or verified, of holding a belief about something that exists beyond direct experience. That is, in a word, religion, or the precursor to it, or the seed of it. And the question of when humans first crossed that threshold is one of the most fascinating questions in the entire field of human prehistory. So let's look at the evidence. The oldest confirmed burials in the archaeological record sit at around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago, in the Middle Stone Age in Africa and the Middle Paleolithic in the Levant, the region that now covers Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and surrounding areas. Skhul Cave, which we opened with, is one of the key sites. Excavated in the 1930s, it contained at least 10 individuals buried in the cave floor. Several showed signs of deliberate placement,
bodies positioned in specific ways, objects placed alongside them. One individual had a boar jaw, another appeared to have been buried with a large mammal bone. The positioning of the bodies was too deliberate to be accidental. A nearby site called Qafzeh Cave, also in northern Israel, contains what many researchers consider the oldest intentional burials found to date, around 90,000 to 100,000 years old. At Qafzeh, 15 individuals were found buried in the cave. Several were children. One, a young adolescent, was buried with the antlers of a fallow deer placed across the body. The antlers had been deliberately selected. They showed signs of being carried to the site, not found there. Think about that. Someone carried a set of deer antlers to a burial site and placed them on a child's body. That is not a practical act. That is not accidental. That is a deliberate, symbolic gesture made by someone who believed, in some way, on some level, that it mattered. At another site called Skhul, a shell bead was found that may have been a personal ornament worn by the deceased. Personal ornamentation is itself a marker of abstract thought. It implies identity, status, self-representation. Burying someone with their ornaments implies those things continue to matter after death.
These sites together paint a picture of anatomically modern humans, people biologically identical to us, performing intentional burials with symbolic elements at least 100,000 years ago. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because it's not just modern humans who were burying their dead. Around the same time, and in some cases possibly earlier, Neanderthals were doing it too. This is the detail that changes the entire shape of the story. Neanderthals are not modern humans. They are a separate species, or depending on who you ask, a subspecies, that diverged from our common ancestors several 100,000 years ago. They had larger brains than us by volume, though differently shaped. They were physically more robust. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they disappeared. For a long time, the dominant narrative in human prehistory was that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans, that they were smart enough to survive, but not smart enough to think symbolically, that the big cognitive leap, art, language, ritual, belief, was something that happened in modern humans and modern humans only. The burials complicated that story significantly. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq is the most famous example. Excavated in the 1950s and 60s by archaeologist Ralph Selecki, it contained the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals. Several appeared to have been deliberately buried. One individual, Shanidar 4, became the subject of one of the most debated findings in all of prehistoric archaeology.
Soil samples taken from around the burial contained large concentrations of pollen. Selecki interpreted this as evidence that flowers had been placed on the body, that a Neanderthal had been given a flower burial, roughly 60,000 years ago. The implications were enormous. A flower burial implies grief. It implies beauty. It implies that someone wanted the dead to have something living, something fragrant, something that represented more than just the physical fact of death. It implied that Neanderthals had an emotional and perhaps spiritual relationship with death that we had assumed was uniquely human. For decades, Shanidar 4 was called the flower burial. It showed up in textbooks. It shaped public understanding of Neanderthals. It became one of the most emotionally resonant findings in all of paleoanthropology. And then, in the 1990s and 2000s, researchers started pushing back. The pollen, they argued, could have been introduced by burrowing rodents, specifically a small animal called the Persian jerd, which nests in caves and carries flowers and plant material into burrows. The pollen concentrations might have nothing to do with intentional burial, and everything to do with a rodent with a collecting habit. The debate has never been fully resolved. Some researchers still support the flower burial interpretation. Others are firmly in the contamination camp. The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. But here is the thing.
Even if you remove the flowers entirely, even if you accept the most skeptical reading of Shanidar 4, you still have 10 Neanderthal individuals in a cave, several of whom appear to have been deliberately placed after death. The positioning of Shanidar 3, who had a healed rib wound suggesting he had survived a serious injury and been cared for before death. Shanidar 1, an older individual who had survived multiple major injuries, a withered arm, a healed skull fracture, possible blindness in one eye, injuries that would have required extended care from others to survive. These are not people who were simply disposed of. These were individuals who mattered to their group while alive and appeared to have been treated with intention after death. Whether that constitutes belief in an afterlife is another question, but it constitutes, at minimum, a relationship with death that goes beyond the practical. So here's where the big debate sits. Is burial evidence of belief in an afterlife, or is it evidence of something slightly different, something like social memory, or emotional attachment, or hygienic necessity? This is not a trivial distinction. Some researchers argue that early burial was primarily practical. Bodies decompose, they attract scavengers. Disposing of a body in a controlled way, burying it, keeps the camp safe and manages the immediate problem of death without requiring any metaphysical interpretation. Others argue that the moment you start placing objects with the dead, the practical argument falls apart entirely. You don't need to bury someone with a boar jaw for hygiene reasons. You don't need to place antlers on a child's body for safety reasons. The presence of grave goods is the key signal. It tells you that whoever did this believed in some functional sense that the dead person still had needs, or still had an identity, or was going somewhere. The cognitive archaeologist David Lewis Williams has argued that the shift towards symbolic thought, the capacity for ritual, for abstract belief, for representing things that don't physically exist, is the defining transition in human prehistory. More significant in some ways than any technological development, because it's the thing that makes human culture possible. The ability to believe in things you cannot see or verify is the root of every religion, every legal system, every social contract, every story ever told. And burial is one of the earliest material signatures of that capacity. When you find a body placed with intention, with objects, with what looks like ceremony, you are finding evidence that someone had that capacity, that they could hold an abstract belief about death and act on it, that they were, in the deepest cognitive sense, like us. Now, there's a layer to this story that often gets skipped over, and it's worth pausing on.
Modern humans, Homo sapiens, appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago, but the oldest confirmed burials are around 100,000 to 120,000 years old. That leaves a gap of roughly 180,000 years in which anatomically modern humans existed without, as far as we can tell, burying their dead. What was happening in that gap? Part of the answer is that we might just be missing the evidence. Burial preserves bodies far better than surface exposure, but it doesn't guarantee preservation. 300,000-year-old burials would be extraordinarily difficult to identify. The absence of evidence from that period doesn't mean burial wasn't happening. It might just mean we haven't found it. But part of the answer might be that the cognitive shift happened gradually, that the capacity for symbolic thought, for ritual, for belief, for the kind of abstract reasoning that produces intentional burial didn't appear all at once with the first anatomically modern humans, that it developed over tens of thousands of years, expressed differently in different populations, and became consistent and widespread only relatively recently in our evolutionary history. This is actually the more unsettling implication, because it means that being biologically human, having the brain and body of Homo sapiens, wasn't enough on its own to produce belief. Something else had to develop. Some additional layer of cognitive or cultural complexity had to accumulate before humans started acting on the idea that death was a transition rather than a termination. We don't know exactly when that happened. We don't know where it happened first. We don't know whether it happened once and spread or independently in multiple places. These are open questions. Big ones.
What we do know is what the record shows, by around 40,000 years ago. By that point, the archaeological signature of modern human behavior is unmistakable. Cave art, personal ornaments, long-distance trade in symbolic objects, musical instruments, and burial, elaborate, intentional, symbolically rich burial at sites across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Sunghir burial site in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, is one of the most extraordinary examples.
2 children were found buried head to head in a long grave, covered in thousands of mammoth ivory beads, roughly 10,000 beads in total, that had been sewn onto their clothing. Making those beads would have required an estimated 10,000 hours of work. Someone spent that time for children who were already dead. There is no practical explanation for that. There is no hygienic or survival-based reason to spend 10,000 hours making beads for a burial. The only explanation is that it mattered, that the belief system of the people who did it assigned enormous significance to how the dead were treated, that those children were going somewhere or were something that required that level of investment. At around the same time, the Paviland burial in Wales, dated to around 33,000 years ago, shows a young man buried with ivory rods, ivory bracelets, and perforated shells. His bones were covered in red ochre, giving him the now famous name the Red Lady of Paviland, despite being male. Red ochre, iron oxide, appears repeatedly in ancient burials across multiple continents. The color red, the color of blood, used to cover the dead. Whether it represented life, blood, return, or something we can't now recover, it was used deliberately, consistently, and over vast distances.
These are not isolated incidents. By 40,000 years ago, intentional burial with grave goods is widespread. The belief system is in place. Whatever cognitive shift had to happen, had happened. So when did the belief in something after death actually start? The honest answer is that we can't know exactly. Belief is not a physical object. It doesn't fossilize. We can only read its material signatures, the objects placed, the positions chosen, the ochre spread, the flowers possibly laid. But here's a reasonable reconstruction of what the evidence suggests. The capacity for the kind of symbolic thought that produces belief in an afterlife probably began emerging in Homo sapiens somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, alongside the development of language and complex social structure. But it wasn't consistently expressed in burial behavior until around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago, and even then it may have been intermittent, variable between populations, and not yet the kind of systematic cultural practice it would become. By around 40,000 years ago, it was systematic. It was widespread. It was producing burials of breathtaking symbolic complexity. Whatever the belief was, whatever these people thought happened after death, they were acting on it with extraordinary consistency and investment. And the Neanderthal evidence complicates the story in a way that should make us humble. Because if Neanderthals were also burying their dead, even without flowers, even in a simpler form, then the capacity for this kind of behavior may predate modern humans entirely. It may go back to our common ancestor. It may be something that emerged in the genus Homo, not just in Homo sapiens. Which would mean that belief in something after death is not a modern human invention. It's an old one, maybe older than our species. Here's the part that tends to land differently the longer you sit with it. Go back to that cave on Mount Carmel, back to the person standing over that body, holding a boar jaw, deciding where to place it. That person didn't have language the way we have language, didn't have writing, didn't have philosophy or theology or any of the formal systems we've built to handle questions about death. They had a body, a hole in the ground, and a feeling, some version of the feeling that this wasn't just an ending, that the person in the ground was still something, still mattered, still in some sense was. And 100,000 years later, you still have that feeling, in some version of it, in some context of it, dressed up in the particular religious or cultural vocabulary of wherever you grew up, you still have it. The persistence of that intuition across 100,000 years of cultural change, migration, language shift, technological revolution, and historical upheaval is one of the more remarkable things about being human. It didn't start with any specific religion. It started in a cave with a jaw and a person who couldn't quite accept that someone they knew had simply stopped. And maybe that's all belief in an afterlife has ever been. Not a doctrine, not a theology, just that, the refusal to let someone be entirely gone. The thing that lives inside that act, inside that deliberate, careful, symbolically loaded burial,
is the same thing that lives inside every funeral ritual that has ever been performed since. The same thing that makes us place flowers on graves today.
It's very old. Older than civilization, older than writing, older possibly than our species. And it started, as best we can tell, in a cave with a body, and someone who decided that leaving wasn't the same as being gone. If this kind of mystery interests you, hit like and subscribe, because next time we're going somewhere even older and stranger than this. We're going to look at why humans are afraid of the dark. Not the childhood version of it, not the monster under the bed fear that you're supposed to grow out of. The deeper version, the one that never quite leaves. The one that kicks in at 2 a.m. in a house you've lived in for 10 years when you hear something you can't immediately explain. Because that fear has a reason, an evolutionary one. And when you find out what your ancestors were actually dealing with in the dark, what was out there waiting every single night for hundreds of thousands of years, the fear stops feeling irrational entirely. That's next time. I'll see you in that one.